raise a glass to the past and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome one and all to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It is time once again to pour up a glass and to pull up a chair as we gather together here in our very favorite corner of the Cross-Time Pub, cruising through time and space and excavating the story of humankind throughout all seven of the ages. And as always, I'm very glad to be joined right here as we pony up yet again to discuss history and archaeology with my friends and cohorts, two guys I don't ever get to see enough, but I did get to see one of you fairly recently, James Waldo and Jason Pentrail, who I got to have lunch with the other day. Man, it had been far too long since the most recent time I had seen you, and it was great to be in your presence yet again.
Yeah, it was a great time. I was looking forward to the event. We got to meet up with not only each other, but several of our friends and former guests of the show, Dr. Joanne Ballard, Dr. Malcolm LeCompte, of course, George Howard. So we had a great crew, met a lot of new people, met listeners of the show. So it was great to be there and certainly catch up with you, Micah.
Absolutely. And of course, the only thing that was missing while we were down there was James Waldo. How are things going over there in Arkansas, my friend?
Well, Mike, I'm doing fine, but it is summertime west of Mississippi. Son, it is hot here and has been all week.
Yeah, we've had incredible temperatures here, too. I mean, in the mountains, it's not uncommon in the summer for it to get up to 90. Usually, you start seeing those temperatures around August or September. I saw them yesterday. I mean, it was 90 degrees yesterday, and I realized this when I had the air conditioning on, and I was still sitting here baking, and I had to go, okay, what is going on? I mean, is there a storm coming and it's humidity? No, it was good old-fashioned, dry summer, 90-degree heat. And we just celebrated the solstice only days ago. In fact, I was down there on Lake Lure, North Carolina, with my brother and his lovely wife, and we were out there in kayaks watching the moonrise on the summer solstice. And I tell you, this is true every time I am looking at especially something like a celestial event, a moonrise or something, on the solstice, I think about the archaeological sites that we've been to and the solar and the other alignments that are often represented at those ancient sites, the archaeoastronomers of yore and their knowledge of the skies and the movement of the celestial bodies. It's really fascinating stuff.
It is hard not to think about that stuff. You know, I thought about it at the solar eclipse this year. You know, we were in the path of totality. I didn't have to go anywhere. I just went back in the backyard and we watched from there. And you know, this has been talked about ad nauseum, but what I thought about was if the power that you could have over your population, if you were learned in those type of things, and you could predict those type of things with some regularity, you could really impress a lot of folks and kind of get them to do what you want, right?
That's true. Well, not only did some of the ancient builders of these megalithic sites do this kind of thing. And also, I should say that on the subject of megaliths, you know, we were able to see a lot of really interesting theories about that subject and also catch up with some of our friends at the Cosmic Summit who are members of the Comet Research Group. That was the reason that Jason and I were in Greensboro, and we got to see Malcolm LeCompte, the first time we have met Dr. LeCompte. So that was just in itself a high point of the entire event, finally getting to meet Malcolm and also getting to hang out with Randy Daniel. Jason, you know, I stayed up way too late one night talking with Dr. Daniel about North Carolina archaeology. I mean, that too was worth the entire trip down there to Greensboro. There was so much fun stuff going on. Our longtime friend George Howard, of course, put that event on. He's been a guest on the program in the past, and for a long time, that episode, which dealt with the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, was one of our most popular. So it was great to get down there and to, you know, network with some of our favorite people and scientists in the community who are working on that aspect of southeastern archaeology. But James, coming back to the point about how you might know what was happening in the ancient skies. At least as recently as around 2,000 years ago, we know that there were pretty advanced methods of doing that kind of thing. At least somebody had developed one. And we know that because, of course, of the famous mechanism retrieved from the Antikythera wreckage there in 1901. And this story came across my news feed, and I thought, when you were mentioning that this might be good to throw into the mix right here, because they have now been able to discern some new things, new features or actually in this case maybe the lack thereof, things that are missing from the Antikythera mechanism. And they're doing this using scientific techniques used to analyze ripples in space-time, in other words, gravitational waves. And what they're trying to do is establish the number of holes that would have been in one of the broken rings of the mechanism with gravitational wave detection technology. Now, it's quite interesting to think that we have technology developed for one purpose like this in the realm of physics, and this based primarily on the predictions of Albert Einstein. But they're finding a unique application for that is helping to reveal some new insights about this extremely precocious, lost ancient technology. And I call it that because, again, it seems very likely that someone or several somebodies had developed this kind of technology over time, but we only know of one device, the so-called Antikythera mechanism, where we see the fruition of those developments, and hence I call it a lost technology. Now, there is, of course, the possibility that somebody might have made one of those, and there was some incredible genius who only built one, but I find that pretty unlikely. In my view, there probably had to be some developments leading up to that. The question is, where are the evidences of all those developments? Where are the similar mechanisms? Where are the other kinds of devices that seemingly would have been capable of what the mechanism seemed to perform? And that, again, had everything to do with astronomy. So, James, to your point, whoever owned the Antikythera mechanism back 2,000 so years ago would have been a wizard, essentially.
Yeah, and I think those, my opinion anyway, is that the evidence of that development and that lead up to it and similar mechanisms are probably all underwater somewhere.
That's exactly where the Antikythera mechanism was. And, whether it has to do with sea level rise or it is, of course, technologies being lost as a result of shipwrecks like the Antikythera mechanism was, there's probably a whole lot of the unknown bits and pieces of ancient history going all the way back in time, maybe further back than history was actually recorded, and that probably exists somewhere underwater. But now, of course, as we know here at Seven Ages, a lot of it is also found underground. Jason, tell us a little bit about this North Carolina site that you were telling us about, which actually is, I believe, in a coastal region. Is that correct?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And this is a big story. It's getting starting to really get a lot of attention. North Carolina builders unearth major archaeological find. Lawmakers want to help them build over it. So this story is coming to us from WRAL News, state government reporter Will Doran. And so we'll get into it here. Lots of details to cover. A coastal housing development at the center of a political battle inside the state legislature is sitting atop the state's biggest Native American find in decades, North Carolina chief archaeologist says. The developers of the Bridgeview neighborhood paid millions of dollars for the land, where they've already built some homes and plan to build dozens more along the Intracoastal Waterway in Carteret County's Cedar Point between Jacksonville and Emerald Isle. It's an area I've been through quite a few times. But after they dug up bones and alerted authorities, the investigation turned into an archaeological dig. Acting state archaeologist, which I believe is now the actual state archaeologist, Chris Southerly, says it's the most significant find he's seen in 30 years in North Carolina and possibly one of the most important ever uncovered in the state. The developers and some state lawmakers have downplayed the findings as they push for construction to resume, but Southerly says more than 2,000 pieces of evidence found buried below the surface point to the presence of longhouses, drying racks for fish, ritual sites, and other features of a prominent village that could have been home to some of the first people to meet with early English colonists. Quote, in the European contact period, it could have been part of the Powhatan Confederation, the Indians that were met by the Jamestown's settlers, Southerly says. Southerly adds that people lived here for another 1,000 years or more before then, and the area between what's now Wilmington and New Bern, he said, is right where two broad groups of people, the Algonquin speakers from the north and the Siouan speakers from the south and west, would have converged and had their own cross-cultural exchanges centuries before the Europeans showed up. New changes to state law being debated in the state Senate, however, could allow the particular development to move forward by making it harder for Southerly and his office to intervene and block construction when developers find what might be considered historically significant items. That change would apply to all construction in the state and to any type of historical find, not just Native American sites. It's been pushed by Senator Michael Lazzara. He's a Republican of Onslow, who WRAL reported last week had received at least $7,500 from the developers behind the project. Nearly all of that money came in May of 2022, the same month state officials wrote an initial memo detailing their interest in the unassessed prehistoric archaeological sites that the developers had accidentally stumbled across. So they move down and talk about some of the other details. Partners for the development company Cedar Point Developers LLC haven't responded to multiple requests for comment. Lazzara said that the campaign contributions from the developers had nothing to do with his advocacy for changing the law, and that he wanted to make the change to help developers anywhere in the state of North Carolina. State officials confirmed Tuesday that the project owed by his donors is the only one statewide that is currently being held up for archaeological review. It goes on to talk about threats to tourism, as well as some various other issues, very, very important to this discussion. And then it wraps up with some of the legislators' positions. Southerly said that the state's first goal is to never dig up artifacts and move them to a museum or lab to be studied, but rather to leave them in place, especially when grave sites are part of the equation, since federal law requires special consultations with tribes when moving and reinterring remains, which can be expensive, part of the NAGPRA Act, intrusive and time-consuming. To him, the best option would be for the developers to either donate or sell the land to the state or one of the private nonprofit historic conservancy groups. Discussions, he said, he had already tried to get started. So it goes on to talk about some of the indigenous people who are getting involved, local tribe members, others that are trying to save this site before the rest of it is turned into a large, very large neighborhood. And some of the infrastructure has already been built, and some of the houses have also already been built on the site.
So this is one of those classic cases where, again, cultural resource management is so important, right? We have to have archaeologists who are able to go in there and assess a site when something along the lines of a construction project happens upon archaeological remains, remnants, features. In other words, when an archaeological site is discovered. And, this is one of the reasons why I was so disheartened when we were talking with Dr. Randy Daniel, and he recently told us about one of the universities here in North Carolina that has done away with its archaeology and anthropology program. And I'm thinking, and literally this was what I asked him when we were having this conversation. I said, what about cultural resource management? What about the archaeologists that we need who can go out there and who can assess these sites and who can make determinations when these kinds of things are found? Again, I know that there are people on the other side of that equation who say, look, we've got a huge, operation going on here. We've got contracts, we've got deadlines we've got to meet. And yet on the other side of that, again, we also could have historic remains of some of the first contact between the New World and the indigenous inhabitants that were here and the European settlers who arrived around that time. So naturally, it's important that we see both sides of the equation, but we should not turn a blind eye to the importance of preserving our heritage and, of course, studying the archaeology that helps fill in the missing pieces where the historical record is unfulfilled and incomplete.
No, great points all around. And, making sure that we cover both sides of this. Some of the concerns from the political entities and also the developers are also discussed here in this particular article. So I just want to read a small portion of that. It says, quote, some Republican lawmakers say that the state has become too aggressive in trying to protect even the smallest of archaeological finds. They say that the rules are stifling growth and putting an unfair burden on home builders who then pass on the costs to everyone else. Quote, in Harnett County, we had a developer, and I think this got resolved, he says, but they found 3 arrowheads and 2 pieces of pottery on the site that he was building, said Senator Jim Bergen, a Republican from Hartnett, during a recent legislative debate. Quote, a multiple 100-acre site, and it stopped everything. He had to hire an archaeologist and spent $300,000 on that investigation. A spokesman for the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, whose archaeologists are in charge of ordering such stoppages, said that in the past 4 years, more than 98% of all projects that underwent review ended up getting the green light. Of 737 total projects, he said only 13 resulted in a recommendation for further archaeological study. So again, we're looking back at that cultural resources management, and we're seeing that 98% of these projects are being pushed through. However, I don't think what we're looking at here, this is not an example of 3 arrowheads and a couple pieces of pottery. This is a major site that could literally change the history of North Carolina and all of the coastal states, including my own of South Carolina. So I think it's well worth looking into a little bit further before any permanent decision is made.
Right. Note the obvious distinction between the examples presented here. James, go ahead.
Yeah. So this particular situation is probably not representative of the bulk of the archaeological finds that are found on construction sites or property that's being developed for other uses. One thing, and as you all know, I work for the federal government, work for the Corps of Engineers, and I don't work in regulatory, but there's a lot of overlap with some of the stuff that we do. And even the Corps of Engineers, like down in Texas, when they're putting in making new lakes, there's all this archaeological front end work that gets done, and sites get curated. Even human remains, they get curated, right? And they get documented and all that. And then eventually the lake gets filled in and all that stuff goes underwater. But they get out there and, and try to document it as well. But, there's a happy medium in the middle of this where, if you go too far to one side where you try to preserve everything, it's bad for business, right? It's bad for everybody, really, because what happens is it increases the risk for the developers and the builders and everybody that's involved. And you run the risk of losing money, right? And when money starts getting lost on things, people quit working on it, or it gets really expensive for the end user, which is the home buyer or whoever ultimately ends up with the property. But if you're too permissive, you end up losing a lot of you end up losing a lot of cultural heritage, and a lot of different things don't get lost. But and the other thing, I forgot to make this point on the other side, is if you're too restrictive, people just don't report it. Right. You get out on job sites and people are digging and digging and digging, and they dig something up. They're like, we're just going to pretend like we didn't see that, and we're just going to keep rocking. Right. So there has to be some kind of, a middle ground that serves both interests. Right. I mean, I don't really necessarily agree with spending $300,000 on an archaeological survey for a, 300-acre parcel where you found a couple of broken points and a piece of pottery, shard. I mean, okay, North Carolina is completely covered in that, in that kind of thing, and curated and then move on. I think is probably the way to go. But like I said, find some ground in the middle that works for everybody, because otherwise everything starts to get damaged. Right, the heritage starts to get damaged, business gets damaged. You're forcing contractors and developers to start to buy politicians, basically, or, donate to people's campaigns. Oh, that doesn't have anything to do with this $300 million we're getting ready to lose on this investment we made. I mean, of course it is. But, can you prove that in court of law? Probably not.
Yeah, all great points. And also, as you were talking, an interesting bumper sticker idea came to mind. James Waldo, geologist, keep on rocking. Hey, Jason, you want to tell us what's happening over there in the Crosstime Pub?
Yeah, well, the Crosstime Pub is a great place to be. It's our Patreon site, so we have several podcasts over there for you to enjoy. The Green Dragon Book Club, that is a very special podcast we do once a month, rather. And remember, that one is made for the people, by the people. So all of our Patreons are welcome to come on that show and participate with us and discuss the book. I read the book to our guests, and they just get to give the comments. So they got the easy part. We also have the Crosstime Pub by James and myself, and Micah, if he can make it over there sometimes, we'll certainly be looking forward to having him as well. And also the Digging Deeper podcast, where I get to sit down with various people. In fact, the last one that I did was with Dr. Randy Daniel from East Carolina University, and we no time limit, no limit on questions. We just kind of get into it and talk and get all the details out of our guests. It's a great way to really build relationships with them, but also really get into the fine details that we don't always have time for on the main show. So you can find all of that over there on Patreon. Just type in 7Ages Audio Journal. It'll pop right up, and just hit the subscribe button. We have 3 tiers to choose from, and I think you'll be more than happy with all 3 of them.
Absolutely. And I do hope to get in there and join on a few more of those. Now that, of course, my schedule is finally slowing down just a little bit. I think I spent more of June so far away from home than I've actually been here at headquarters. I'm looking forward to actually being back at home for a few weeks. So that all said, again, we have so much, and you definitely want to follow us online, of course, at 7ages.org and all social media channels. We're on X, and we're also on Facebook. Facebook far more active there than we are on the artist formerly known as Twitter. Definitely check out the Facebook page for 7 Ages that Jason moderates. But right here and now, it's time for us to dive into the interview portion because we have to look at the Mill Cove Complex and also more deeply at some of Florida's enigmatic mound builders. That's coming up right here in a moment with Dr. Keith Ashley, our guest, when we return here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Tonight on the 7 Ages Audio Journal, we welcome Dr. Keith Ashley. Dr. Ashley is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of North Florida. His current research focuses on indigenous peoples and the history of southeastern North America with a particular focus on Florida. He has been actively involved in archaeological excavations with UNF students throughout northeastern Florida, including the Mill Cove Complex since 1999. Dr. Ashley, welcome to the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. And also joining us tonight is Victoria Hayes. She is a graduating senior in anthropology at the University of North Florida. Her honors thesis focuses on a techno-functional analysis of pottery from the South Field area of the Mill Cove Complex. She plans to continue her research in graduate school at the University of Florida. So tonight we are going to be talking about the Mill Cove Complex. So Dr. Ashley, just to let you know, you were suggested as a guest to the show by one of our very loyal listeners, Renee Pinto. She also does a lot of work with us here on the 7 Ages team. And I believe she had attended one of your in-person lectures and said, I think Dr. Keith Ashley would be a great addition to our podcast. And after reading everything that you've been involved with, I agree. So I'm very excited to get into the Mill Cove Complex tonight. So, but before we do that, let's learn a little bit about each of you. So Dr. Ashley, you know, Jacksonville, Florida, that whole region, it's an area I'm familiar with because I live in Charleston here in South Carolina. So I've been through that area many times. Are you from the Florida area originally, and how did you end up there?
Yeah, believe it or not, I grew up in Jacksonville, and then I graduated from high school, and I really wasn't ever planning to come back here. It just kind of worked out this way. So I went and got my undergraduate degree at Auburn University and then a master's at Florida State University. And then I went on and did cultural resource management throughout the Southeast. And then eventually went back and got my PhD at University of Florida and just kind of found my way here.
Wow. All right. So that is very unusual. A Florida person through and through. So again, well, that's great. It's great to be able to work in your home area, something that you're familiar with. And I'm sure that makes the archaeological history there all the more interesting. Also, we want to find out why and how Victoria has chosen the path of anthropology. So again, Victoria, we welcome you to the show. I'm very happy that you're going to be moving on to the University of Florida. Where does your interest in this subject come from?
Thank you. And it started in sophomore year of undergraduate. So I started college during COVID, but my first in-person anthropology class was North American Indians with Dr. Ashley. And I kind of got an interest in the subject from that. So then the following summer, I did the archaeological field school and really enjoyed field work. So then I took archaeological lab methods. And I think that class kind of solidified that I want to pursue it as a career.
Well, excellent. Yeah, it's once that bug bites you, it's hard to turn away from it. The same thing happened with me. It's such a incredible area of field of study that unfortunately a lot of people still don't know that much about. But the Jacksonville area, I've done archaeology throughout the Southeast, but Jacksonville is one area I have not heard much about. So I'm very much looking forward to getting into this tonight. Dr. Ashley, we're going to begin with you. Let's talk about the period of the Mill Cove Complex. So what time period are we talking about here?
We're talking about probably about 1,000 years ago. So we're looking at maybe 940 to about 1300 CE. So it would kind of, in the broader Southeast, it would be the early Mississippian period. Locally, we call it St. John's too.
Okay, very good. Yeah, I've had the opportunity to be in and around the St. John's River, and it's quite an impressive complex there along that river system. Works its way through a large portion of Florida there. So the Mill Cove Complex, is that referring to the area, what the area is called today, or where does that name come from?
Well, right within the St. John's River where the site is, there's a large embayment in the river channel, and it's called Mill Cove. So it's just on the west side of this kind of feature within the river. So it's called the Mill Cove Complex. It's about 10 miles west of the mouth of the St. John's River. We're in the heart of pretty much downtown.
Okay, I got you.
Anyone's familiar with the Jacksonville area, we're in the Fort Caroline area. Okay,
gotcha. Yep, I've been through that area a few times. So now that we all have an idea of the time period that we're talking about, again, I don't typically think of those Mississippian type settlements so much in that region. So let's talk a little bit about what we know to this point about this particular group of people. Are we looking at typical types of Mississippian behaviors, mound building, ceremonial interactions between the people? What kind of population numbers are we looking at?
I think conventionally people will look at Mississippian, there'll be certain traits that they say that they manifest. Because sometimes the word Mississippian is used as a geographical area. Sometimes it's used to represent certain cultural traits. Other times it's a time period. So really, our area lacks some of what would be considered to be the centrist kind of characteristics for Mississippian. They're not farmers, or we doubt they have chiefdom level socialization. It is a little different than the kind of the heartland of the Mississippian world. A lot of times we're kind of couched at being on the periphery of the Mississippian world.
Okay, well, that's very interesting in itself because, yeah, we generally think of that Mississippian time period as, heavy agriculture, lots of artwork and things of that nature. But here we're seeing a little bit different setup. So let's first talk about the landscape and the resources in the area and why agriculture may not have been a primary focus for these people. What do we see as far as that goes?
The area in general offered really rich estuarine resources. So they primarily subsisted off of fish and shellfish. We find some small mammals, but the amount pales in comparison to the fish bones that we find. So the area and where they were located, Mill Cove and near the St. John's River, offered a huge variety.
Sure, yeah.
But they were interacting with agriculturalists.
Okay. So how do we determine that interaction? Is there anything that's being found at the Mill Cove Complex that is indicative of them interacting with maybe groups of people in the region that are more intensive on the agricultural side?
Yeah, I think with our research at the Mill Cove Complex, we're taking this really kind of multi-scalar perspective. So we're trying to look at social relations that are kind of at the local level within the site, or people that they may be dealing with on a daily basis, and then expand that a little bit to a larger regional, and then to a super regional like the Mississippian world. So we have materials from far-flung areas of southeastern North America and the Midwest that end up here at the Mill Cove Complex. So they're not farmers. We have great evidence that there is no corn. We get corn here later, not till 1450. So what Mill Cove thrives is during that early Mississippian period, and they're really involved in these far-flung interaction networks.
Yeah, so another trait that we normally see within that Mississippian community is that long-distance trade. And as I was reading over some of the specifics about the Mill Cove Complex that you provided, Dr. Ashley, I found it really amazing, some of the things that have been found there at the excavations, but we'll get more into that here momentarily. So we discussed earlier about the location of the Mill Cove Complex. And now I know that area. I lived for a while in Merritt Island around Cape Canaveral. And I know that there was a lot of sort of barrier island people out that way and moving in and around that area. When we say regional, are we seeing, is there any way to determine differences between other cultures in Florida interacting at this time?
So yeah, we would base that on certain types of pottery or artifacts that are coming from other areas of Florida. sometimes pottery can be tricky. It can be a type or a style that's found elsewhere, but they could just be emulating and making it locally themselves. So we've been doing neutron activation analysis and other types of chemical compositional studies to try to see that. So we are seeing connections between our area, northeastern Florida, I mean, extreme northeastern Florida, and the middle part of the St. Johns River, which is closer to the central part of the state. And really, most of our best evidence for interactions are to the north, into Georgia and into the broader Mississippian world.
Okay, well, that's very interesting as well. Now, Victoria, I want to come over to you for a moment because I know that you seem to have a real interest in the pottery from the South Field area of the Mill Cove Complex. So when it says that your honors thesis will focus on a techno-functional analysis of that pottery, tell us a little bit about what that means and what exactly your goal is for your thesis.
Yeah, so we've dug at 13 areas in total. Mill Cove, Southfield is one of those areas, and it consists of 5 core units right now. So what I've been doing for my honors thesis is reanalyzing all of the pottery that came from those 5 units. And the 5 units are all situated immediately next to one another. And I've been essentially trying to transform sherds into pots. So I've been making something called vessel lots, where I look at and lay out all of the pottery and based on the rims, try to make refits of body sherds to rim sherds. And then I'm measuring various attributes like pitting and scrapes and soot. And I'm trying to connect that with site activities like cooking, serving.
Yeah, that kind of
trying to figure out more about the area.
Sure. That type of research is certainly labor intensive. I have been down that road myself, and it's more intense than most people realize when you start talking about pottery, especially when you're trying to determine what it was used for within that area. So congratulations on that. That is quite the endeavor for sure. Now, Dr. Ashley, when I was looking at some of the photographs from the site, I was actually pretty shocked to see where some of these excavations are occurring. Let's talk a little bit about where some of these excavations are happening in relation to local residences.
Yes, right now we are working in people's front and backyards. So we're on private property. So beginning in 1999, we started to kind of talk to and consult with a couple of the landowners, and they were really, really excited about what we're doing, very amenable to us coming out there and working on their properties. So really the kind of the eastern end of the Mill Cove Complex, which is near the Shield Mound, these are older kind of properties. So there's like a house and then a long linear property with really little development. Then as we move kind of west, it's all kind of cookie cutter 1980, 1990 subdivisions where everything's pretty much destroyed. So this really eastern end, it's kind of open, and all the landowners have been great. They've conveyed all the artifacts to the University of North Florida. They've been protecting the site. They're making sure people aren't out there trying to loot or do anything along those lines. So we've had a great relationship with all the landowners.
Well, that's great to hear. Certainly when a community can get involved with looking after and protecting a site, that's always encouraged. But what a unique place to have a site. You know, initially when I was looking at it, I was thinking, you know, how are you able to find anything stratigraphically? Because you would think that, you know, the process of building and dumping and heavy equipment moving through there would disturb all of that. So thank you for explaining how that one particular area is more open. So that makes a lot more sense. As we look at the complex itself, there are various things that are found there, mounds, middens. And so let's begin with the kind of the overview, if you will, of what constitutes the site. So what all do we find at the Mill Cove Complex?
One thing about the property, the land today, you said you were in Merritt Island. You probably went to Merritt Island, very flat.
Right.
But this is completely different. This is an area that's undulating and rolling. So these are old relic dune fields and ridges. So it really stands out. So along the bluff, we actually have a bluff here that's probably 20 to 25 feet above the river. We have all this undulating, rolling terrain. It really makes it stand out. It's really different. And they've grafted the site onto this kind of natural relic landscape.
Wow. Yeah, that's again, not something that you normally think of when you think of Florida. But again, I can see how that would certainly be appealing to early people in that area. Now, when we look at the site, we always like to begin with the initial site, the beginning. When was it first found? So I understand that it's been known for quite a while, obviously, as Jacksonville has built up and around it. When was the site first discovered?
So we learned about it through Clarence B. Moore, who was kind of this wealthy Philadelphia socialite who dug Indian mounds, Indigenous monuments in the kind of the 1890s, probably until maybe the early 1920s. So he was in this area and he reported the mounds. So that we know it from that standpoint. In terms of professional archaeology, really there hadn't been anything done. There was one small survey that was done just prior to developing some of the houses in the 1980s, but it was really intermittent and not really intensive. So really the first real excavations were our excavations beginning in 1999.
Okay, so a long history, but the official excavations 1999. So that gives us a much better idea here. Now, there is a couple of what's considered to be mounds there. What is it? Grant and Shields, I believe. Are those traditional mounds that we think of from a Mississippian point? Are they conical mounds? Are they flat top mounds? What are we talking about there?
So the mounds were excavated in 1890. We are doing no mound excavations at all. So this was Clarence B. Moore who was excavating them. The first one, the Grant Mound, which is kind of the western bookend, it's kind of your typical Florida mound. It's a conical dome-shaped mound. It's just writ larger than most of the ones we have in this area. The other one, which is about 750 meters to the east, that's Shields Mound. It actually has a really unusual shape. It seems to be an actual natural dune ridge that's actually been modified and recreated to kind of give it its present shape. And Moore describes it as kind of having a main mound area, kind of a long extending berm that's shaped like a fishhook, and then two embankments that lead from the end of that fishhook feature all the way to a pond. So if you're familiar with Florida, there's another site near Willatka, Florida called Mount Royal, and it has kind of a similar build to that. So it's really unusual.
Yeah, that is very unusual. Again, but I like the way that you described that, using a natural feature and then modifying it for use. I think that's very interesting as well. So as Clarence B. Moore was, as many early antiquarians were at that time, digging through mounds, collecting artifacts, moving up and down river systems, we've heard these stories again and again. However, he did make some rather significant discoveries. So what do we know about the discoveries that were made in the mounds, and what does that say about the connection to a larger region of interaction?
So he dug in Shields Mound and Grant Mound in 1894 and 1895. So he did find a lot of non-local, sometimes we call them exotic materials. So those are materials that are not from the Florida region. So what we do have in there is of galena, likely coming from the Ozark Mountains, maybe in Missouri, Arkansas. We're getting mica and greenstone or basalt, probably coming from the Appalachian Mountains. There is copper that's coming from both the Lake Superior area, but as well as the Appalachian Mountains. So we're getting a lot of these materials that are non-local. And that was basically providing some of the big basis for this really long distance interaction that's going on, that these are kind of in mound context. And like I mentioned before, when we started in 1999, our goal was Clarence B. Moore dug in those mounds. We understand that. We respect the rights of Indigenous people today. So we did not want to do any kind of mound excavations or anything like that. We wanted to look at, hey, what is actually going on within this community itself, away from the mound.
Sure.
And so all the information that we have on things mound related come exclusively from Clarence B. Moore's work in the 1890s.
And in the 1890s, was he journaling this? Was he keeping up with his discoveries? Is that how we know what he found?
Yeah. And so, I think people love and hate Moore. A lot of times he was probably doing a little bit more recording than other people were in the 1890s, but it's still not to the standards that we had. So we get some information about the mound. He tells us about some of the colored sands that he encounters. He tells us a little bit about the stratigraphy. But in terms of specific kind of convenient locations where everything's coming, he's sometimes really vague about that. So it's really hard to get some really good, concrete, kind of contextual information from his work.
Yeah, again, those types of journals and early information can be as confusing as they are helpful if they're not really done in an accurate way. Now, some of what I've heard, now you can confirm this for me or deny it and just let me know what the truth is about the site, but I've heard some of the things that came out of those mounds were as exotic as, copper plates, ground stone celts, long-nosed copper maskets, like something that you would see from Spiro or from Cahokia or even Etowah. Is there truth to those claims about those early artifacts?
Yes. So most of those today are in the National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian. So a lot of times what Moore had went to the, I think it was the National Academy of Sciences in Philadelphia. And later that was bought by Hay. And so it went to the museum in New York and eventually made its way to the Smithsonian. So from that, we know that Moore did publish some of his findings. So we do see line drawings and other things of what he found. So yes, he found the long-nosed god maskets, which are these copper maskets. So right now, in terms of copper, there's only been 7 pair that have been found in all of North America. And everyone thinks that they're being probably manufactured in the American Bottom, the Cahokia area, and they're going out to far-flung areas from there. We have smaller copper plates. And this is a little bit before a lot of the really rich iconography that you see after 1250 CE or 1300 CE in the Southeast. Some people refer to it as the Southeast Ceremonial Complex. We lack a lot of that iconography, but we see repose, embossing, circles, little beadwork and stuff, and copper. So yes, we have that. Galena.
Yeah, it's all fascinating. Let me ask you this, Dr. Ashley, as a native Floridian, seeing those long distance trade items coming in to a site like Jacksonville, what does that mean to you outside of the academics? What does that mean to you as a personal Florida native, someone who has a connection to that sort of thing?
One thing for me is it just shows that the indigenous people, I think sometimes there's this belief by a lot of people that here in Jacksonville, they were just hanging out by the tidal marsh, and that's really all that was going on. What we see here is they're involved in these really interaction networks that are bringing materials in. They're moving around. People are really moving across the landscape. So I think it's really impressive to see that the indigenous people of this area were involved in that type of interaction.
Yeah, for sure. As I'm thinking about this site, the old saying, a good site or a good location is always going to be a good location. Is there, during the excavations, are there any indications of earlier woodland settlements, archaic settlements, anything like that?
So there's no evidence of woodland archaic settlements, but we do find woodland and archaic artifacts there. We haven't found, they're not really in general household garbage areas, but we do find a bunch of woodland points and archaic points. And that's likely their way of connecting the past and making a link from their ancestors' world to their world that we're currently living in.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What do you have to say about that, Dr. Ashley?
So we actually, it's really interesting. We have 2 kind of occupational histories, one near the Grant Mound and one near the Shields Mound, that are a little different. Near the Grant Mound, we do have some middle and late woodland occupations, but earlier we don't have it at all. Anywhere on the site, no Paleozoic, no archaic. And as Victoria mentioned, there are artifacts of that time period, but all those early artifacts, whether it's early archaic, middle archaic, or early woodland, they're occurring within St. John's, that Mississippian context. So they're actually getting these things, these pieces of the past, and utilizing them themselves. If we then move down towards the Shields Mound, it's a single component site. There is nothing earlier there at all. So we're trying to be, I think the interpretation that we are making right now is there may be small scale kind of activities going on of people living here closer to the Grant Mound. And then there's a movement of people down, the St. Johns River, which would be to the north. St. Johns River flows in the opposite direction. So they're going northward. And we think there's a movement of people in, and they are going to actually select out the Shields Mound area. And that's where they are. So then I think the 2 kind of meld together. So I think St. John's 2 here probably becomes this coalition of small resident population and maybe St. John's 2 people moving from kind of further south along the St. John's River. And that's reflected in kind of the deposits that we have.
Yeah, those interactions and those connections are always so at the top of the list, rather, if you will, of connecting those stories together, something that I find very interesting. So I want to talk a little bit about the middens. So middens are one of those things that can teach you so much and give you so much insight to the people that were living there. Here in coastal South Carolina, we have a lot of middens, and over the years, due to storms and erosion and other things, they've produced a lot of pottery, fish hooks, things like that. So are we seeing those same sort of household goods? And Victoria, I'll bring this to you to begin because you have an interest in that pottery. In those middens, are you finding anything that's helping you with your thesis as far as the pottery goes?
Yeah, so pottery is found throughout the site, even in the contexts that have or contain less shell, but it's much more abundant in the midden areas. And one of the best things about middens is we can get a lot of subsistence information from them. So when they deposit like animal or fish bone, because of the oyster shell, the calcium will leach out when it rains and those bones absorb that. So bones serve a lot better in midden context than non-shell context. So we can gain insight into what they're eating. And we also just get more pottery in those areas. So they just provide better samples for research.
Sure. Yeah, it makes great sense. Dr. Ashley?
Yeah, so like Victoria said, we have really this widespread distribution of kind of trash across the site, but we have it sometimes where it's shell midden. So that means the most visible constituent is oyster shell, lots and lots of oyster shell. But in that oyster shell, there are like millions of fish bones that preserve. Then we'll have areas where there's hardly any shell, but we'll still see pottery and a little bit of bone. So we have these really different kinds of deposition throughout the site. And Victoria's, like she mentioned, she's in the Southfield area. So she's really trying to see what's going on there.
Okay, so looking at the different areas of the Mill Cove Complex, is there a rough estimate of how big it was thought that the actual site was at the height of its history?
That's a really tough question. So we know that the two mounds are about 750 meters apart, and there's pretty much evidence of activity during that 950, 1300 range throughout there. But the problem is we don't know what the site was like at any given point of time. Right now, we don't have that temporal resolution that we would like to have. So it's really hard to make a prediction on how many people were there. And like, we just know that it was over a large area, and they're probably moving around and doing some things at different points in time. So it's hard for us to really capture what's it like at 1100, what's it like at 1150. That's one of our ultimate objectives.
Yeah, it's certainly one of those difficulties is honing in on those when you don't have a huge ceremonial area and you're dealing with different mounds and different areas along a river system for sure. I do want to ask this because it is sort of a staple of large complexes such as Spiro. So at Spiro, you have things like that are very unique to that site, such as the engraved shells, Cahokia producing all of the wonderful copper work and the famous side notch points and things like that. And then is there anything from maybe pottery style or anything along those lines that is unique to the Mill Cove Complex?
St. John's pottery, we most commonly we see check stamp designs a lot. We'll see woven designs, so some sort of fabric or weave that they're putting over the pot. And then we have something called fineware, and that's complicated punctations and incisions, and they're often also burnished. And we get those in higher quantities and more amounts at Mill Cove than any other St. John's 2 site in the area.
So it's sort of a general style for the area, but nothing that's specific to the Mill Cove Complex. Dr. Ashley?
Yeah, so no, we don't really have any kind of pottery or anything that's really specific to this area, but other sites, the thing we're really also trying to do, Mill Cove is the biggest site in this area. We're not just focusing on Mill Cove. We want to understand this local community as well. So we're looking at other sites as well. So within these other sites, we're seeing pretty much similar patterns, even though there are some contacts in Mill Cove that are completely different than anywhere else. It's usually in the amount of exotic materials or the amount of potential feasting that's going on. We do have pottery that's called archaeology, and it's not just found at Mill Cove, but we have it in large quantities at Mill Cove. And so we've done neutron activation analysis on it. And what it's showing is, in the sample we've done, It's only about 55, 60 sherds, but it's showing that maybe 40% of that is locally made. 25 to 30% is non-local, and the other we just can't tell right now. That non-local coming from the confluence of the Altamaha, the Ocmulgee, and the Oconee River, which is kind of in that south central Georgia area. So we have that coming in. So we see this great contact and interaction between those two as well.
Yeah, and that's a great point. The Ocmulgee site there in Georgia is a very large site. I've been there myself. It's very impressive. And I would kind of think that may have some influence on a site like this, on an outlying sort of satellite site. Is there any definite connection there?
One thing I should kind of comment on, this is kind of confusing. The Ocmulgee pottery that we're actually finding in that area, this is hunters and gatherers who are actually living a little south of Ocmulgee or Macon Plateau, which is a little bit farther to the north. So what we think is these hunters and gatherers who are making this Ocmulgee pottery, they're establishing St. John's two groups who are here. Mill Cove are establishing, we believe, relations with them to enable them to kind of get through that area, to get up into Macon Plateau or the other Ocmulgee site, to get into the broader Mississippian world. So we think that there's a lot of diplomacy, interactions, alliance building, all these things that are really going on. It's an incredibly dynamic time. And I think in the past, people have always really downplayed St. John's two groups in northeastern Florida having this kind of sophistication in terms of alliance, interactions, and so forth.
Well, speaking of alliances and interactions, something as impressive as that copper work that would have been found there alone is absolutely incredible. But I understand that there is a typical side-notched Cahokian point that has been found on the site. Is that accurate?
So what it is, we have a specific area. One of the 13 areas we're excavating is called Kinsey's Knoll, and we really think it is a high-profile feasting area. It's about 50 meters away from one of the Shields Mound. And in it, it's about a meter, about 3 feet thick of shell. Solid shell, then it tapers out. The amount of animal bone here is just staggering. It's just off the board. And in there, we're getting all kinds of, everyday kinds of fish. We're getting, there's catfish and mullet and trout, redfish, all of those. But we're also getting exotic animals. We have beaver, we have dolphin, we have panther, we have bobcat. We have all these things that are unusual. Also, we've got a little bit of galena. We got a few pieces of mica. We have 2 Cahokia side notch points. Both of them have been verified as Cahokia. We think in the last year we may have a third one that's a preform. So we may have 3 that are actually coming from Cahokia. One other was found in Mount Royal in the 1890s. But when you start looking at some of these artifacts that are coming out of Cahokia, sometimes you'll see them along the Mississippi River, then maybe off some of the larger tributaries near the Mississippi River. But we're way over here in northeastern Florida, so it's really surprising that we have what Clarence being more found in the mounds than what we're kind of finding in some of these non-mound areas.
No, that is fascinating. And, when you really look at it on a topographical map, you realize just how far out of the way that is of where you would expect to see something like that. One more quick question about those side notch points. Are they made maybe out of something Burlington shirt or something that you could trace back to Cahokia, so it's not made of any local material?
Yeah, so most people right now that are looking, is actually, we don't have it now, it's off being looked at, is most people looking at it just macroscopically said they think it's Burlington shirt. One of them is really nice. It's really pristine. It's incredibly thin. The other one is really, really heavily worked, but it looks just like some of the heavily worked ones you see, in the American bottom. And then the other one looks like a preform. So everyone's thinking sometimes proveniencing chert is difficult. So we're having people kind of look at that now to see if we can get a stronger indication that it's not a Florida chert where they're just, emulating it and making it locally, that it's actually going to be something from the American bottom or from, where Burlington chert is.
Sure. Yeah. And of course, that's the first thing that came to mind. So yeah, being able to connect it back to those sources is certainly a key point of the puzzle. Now, as I was reading through the information that was sent to me concerning this site, the Grant and Shield Mounds, of course, are sort of central to the location. We kind of hit on this earlier, but I want to get a little bit further into it. There seems to be various sand colors that were found in the mounds. Now, I've seen this at places like Poverty Point. I've seen this at a few other large mound sites. Of course, Poverty Point being a much earlier site, but yet there was an obvious intention to have different colored sands. What do we know about that as far as it being accurate, and has anything been learned about those sort of stacks of striations and why they may have been those colors?
Yes, we believe that these mounds are kind of accretionary mounds, that they would have episodes of burial, add some dirt, and then it builds up over time. So Moore tells us, again, we're relying kind of on Moore here, is that he encounters white sand or yellow sand. Other instances, he encounters light pink to crimson red sand, which is basically going to be sand that's impregnated with with the ochre or some sort of red pigment to give it, that color. We also see areas that are heavily black, which are probably part of charcoal laden sand. So they probably are using these different color things as part of the kind of the building episodes and representing different things. But we don't have great stratigraphic maps by him. It's just these kind of instances where he'll mention them.
Okay, so that makes sense. Also, I want to revisit Kinsey's Knoll. Now, we just talked a little bit about that, but when we're looking at the totality of the Mill Cove site, what importance is Kinsey's Knoll as far as understanding the site?
So we just really think what we're finding there is just different kind of qualitatively and quantitatively compared to anything else at the site or really at any other St. John's 2 sites in the area. Just the amount of faunal material, like I said it before, it's just truly unbelievable. And so we think this is large-scale feasting that's going on. It's really confined to a specific area. It's really thick shell. It's the thickest shell we have anywhere on the site. Again, there's pottery that we find, and Victoria can kind of attest to that. The pottery at Kinsey's Knoll is larger, tends to be larger, tends to be less worked or damaged than other areas of the site. So it looks like these are special kind of event wares that are being used.
Okay, so are there any like zooarchaeological studies to determine various flora and fauna from the region? Are we seeing ocean fish as well as fresh fish, or a combination of the two?
So really, this is an incredibly rich fisheries where they are. So we don't see much where they're way out in the maritime, they're way out in the ocean or anything like that. We're right here at the estuary, near the mouth of the St. John. So you get this mixture of both freshwater and marine. So, dolphin, we see dolphin today still coming into this area. So they're really accruing an incredible amount of local fish, local flora, local fauna. We're getting, typically at most of these sites, they're fisher folks and shellfish collectors. So fish dominate, but occasionally we get deer and we get other smaller animals, but the amount of deer here is more than any other St. John's 2 site. It pales in comparison to the amount of fish, but we still have seen more deer, especially in Kinsey's Knoll. So it suggests also something else is going on within this area, of the site.
Now, on the site, are you finding lithic materials from Florida, the region? And if so, what are we seeing as far as point types, point styles, things of that nature?
So we have one of my former students who's now working on his PhD at the University of Missouri is looking at the lithics as a study. And what we do see is that we do get these older points within St. John's 2 context. So we'll get, Clarence B. Moore found a turkey tail in the mound. We've gotten what we call earlier Duval, Santa Fe's, and archaic stem points in the St. John's 2 context. So those are coming in kind of finished form, maybe modified them or not using them all, or just use them in maybe a ritual context. What they're doing is they make these small little points that are probably true arrowheads or maybe even drills, these small triangular points. And they're making those really quick, really great. We have no local stone here. So the closest stone for us is kind of in the Gainesville area or kind of towards Georgia, another 140 kilometers away. So what they're doing, what they're making is probably getting a lot of poor quality chert, using it as much as they can for kind of expedient tools. So any of the really nice formal tools we see, they probably are coming in finished form.
Okay, now that in itself is very interesting because, again, they're depending on that material coming in from a long range. So, again, it really speaks to the social interactions that you have to have, the connections that have to be made in order for those goods to transfer. With them being so rich with the fishery on the estuary and all of those things being available, in surrounding sites, is there any indication that they were exporting anything, whether it be food or any type of materials, to other places in the area?
I guess we can turn our attention now to looking at some of the Mississippian sites in the interior part of the southeastern states. We know that They have whelks shells, which are going to be kind of marine-based shells. There's Ilex vomitoria, the Yopon holly, or what people call the black string. There probably were feathers and other things that are more perishable that we don't have. So there are probably going to be specific resources that are found only kind of in the coastal area that end up. So do we have a smoking gun that says, oh, at this Cahokia site, this whelk came from Northeast Florida? No, but we know it's coming from the Atlantic or the Gulf Coast. And the fact that we're getting stuff from Cahokia in those areas, I think we kind of fill in the gaps that some of that stuff is going out of here.
So to this point, you talked about other areas regionally around this particular site that have been excavated or are currently being excavated. Does it seem to indicate that after everything you've looked at in the region, that the Mill Cove Complex is sort of the centerpiece of this area and this culture? Is it the biggest site that you know of?
In our area, Mill Cove is it's the biggest St. John's 2 site, and then there's Mount Royal. But in our immediate, Northeast Florida area, Mill Cove played a huge role.
Yeah, sure. And also, do you see their influence on other surrounding areas? And if so, about how big is that region, Dr. Ashley?
We know that Mill Cove is the largest St. John's 2 site. It's got more diversity of exotic material. It has the biggest mound. So everything about Mill Cove really stands out in the far northeastern area. Like Victoria said, Mount Royal is really, really similar, but Mount Royal is all the way down near Lake George, close to the middle part of the St. Johns River. So those two are the two big communities in northeastern Florida. I would argue that 1,000 years ago, the two most significant sites in terms of contacts with the early Mississippian world in Florida are going to be the Mill Cove Complex and Mount Royal. So here in northeastern Florida, we think maybe 10, 11 other communities that are probably kind of satellites around Mill Cove, but we don't know how much really control Mill Cove exerts over them. It probably held primacy in terms of ritual and things like that, but we're not sure that they really controlled them politically. We don't really think it has that kind of structure here.
Yeah, that would make sense. And it's always interesting, though, to see just how far that influence reaches. Obviously with the bigger Mississippian sites, we see those kind of calling cards, if you will, that really extend hundreds and if not some cases thousands of miles. So it's always interesting to learn more about the influence of those regions. Now, these other excavations that are happening in that area, are all of those University of North Florida projects?
Yes, for the most part, at least the ones that are kind of research-based. We'll get CRM projects that come about that'll be in this area. But we have a summer field school, so every summer we select sites to work on. So we've been working on a few others. So this summer we're going to be on Barrier Island. That's about 10 miles from Mill Cove, Black Hammock Island, and it has these large shell deposits that date to the same time period as Mill Cove. We've worked on another barrier island that has a shell ring, which is the only really shell ring that we know about that dates to 1000 AD. Most of the others are much earlier, late archaic shell rings. So we've been hitting all these other areas, trying to get some basic information for comparative purposes. Kind of a long-term project that we have is really, we call it the Mill Cove Project. The Mill Cove's kind of the centerpiece, but we're really trying to understand the entire area at that point in time.
Yeah, sure. And that makes perfect sense. Now, Victoria, at the beginning of our talk tonight, you mentioned that you had attended a field school. Was the Mill Cove Complex the field school that you took part in, or was that a different location?
So the first field school I attended, it was the Armalino site on Big Talbot Island. It's the Sarah Bay site, and that dates to the 16th century. And then I also did Mill Cove. We did get Mill Cove in January. So I did that the following semester, and I did a directed independent study on it. And we did there for about 2 weeks or 2 weekends.
Yeah, so you've had some experience there and in some other areas as well. So that's great. Well, while we're talking about that, Victoria, as you move forward in your pursuit of your degree, are you planning on studying in the Florida area, or do you have other interests?
Yeah, I'm really interested in Northeast Florida archaeology. So my goal right now is to continue my research on Mill Cove in graduate school. I'd really like to shift my focus on Kinsey's Knoll, the area we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, it sounds like that particular space has a lot to offer. As speaking of everything that's been found there, I always want to make sure that we're thorough when we have the opportunity to speak to people like yourselves who are able to bring us information about these sites that we're not familiar with. Is there any mortuary patterns? Is there anything that can be indicated about burial practices or ceremony at the Mill Cove site? Anything at all, Dr. Ashley?
Again, we would be falling back on what C.B. Moore found, in the 1890s that are kind of poorly, reported. So, we know some basic things, that there are going to be secondary burials and some primary burials. There seems to be a large number. One thing I think we can say with some degree of confidence is that there were large numbers of burials in these things. So these aren't like monuments for just the elite. These seem to be more communal, cemeteries. Again, our emphasis has been away from the mounds.
Yeah, for sure. And that's completely understandable. But again, those indications, those discoveries can always kind of help build that picture. Let me ask you this, that particular area, how is it as far as preservation goes? I mean, the soil itself, is it good for that, or do you see a lot of decay?
Oh, so we're dealing with really fine sand, and these are former beach dunes. So it's incredibly acidic. So everything just does not preserve well. But as Vic had said earlier, that when we have shell middens, all that shell accumulation, all those bones in there are preserved. So we're getting, 1,000-year-old bone. Had it not thrown the shell away at the same time in the middens, we wouldn't have all this bone. So if in certain kinds of situations where we have a lot of shell, we get great preservation. In areas where we don't have any shell, a lot of times it's not very good preservation.
And so there's been no materials found, mats, clothing, anything of that nature?
Nothing like that.
Yeah. Well, when I think of Florida archaeology and preservation, I always think of the Wendover site. And of course, that's a much different type of situation, the way that those people were buried and interred there at that site. But again, those discoveries that were found there are absolutely monumental to the world of archaeology. And of course, they can teach us so much when you're able to see actual materials and things of that nature. So as we move forward with this site, Dr. Ashley, what is coming up in the future for the site? What should we expect to keep our eyes out for?
So we've been really working. So we don't have a graduate program at UNAP, so it's an undergraduate program. So a lot of times this becomes kind of a training ground for students who go on maybe to cultural resource management or go on to graduate school like Vic. So we have a lot of students who, once they go to graduate school, they come back and they do their theses and some dissertations on aspects of Mill Cove. So we've had students that have been doing shark's teeth that have done at Florida State. Someone now is doing the bone, whether it's faunal bone or some of the decorative bones. So we really have a lot of things that are going through the analysis stages at different universities. And so what we're trying to do is try to catch up on the little things. So we're slowing down some of our excavations just so we can get all of this stuff kind of accumulated and collated and really get our kind of big report out. So that's kind of where we are right now. We'll probably still do a little small here and there. For the most part, I think we're winding down.
Sure. And well, as we look at these sites and everything that's being used and utilized today, are you using things like ground penetrating radar? Are you looking at LiDAR scans, anything of that nature to determine more about the site?
And so we've used the LiDAR extensively. And then we're doing just some basic total station mapping. And we've done some ground penetrating radar. That's the next thing we're trying to do in the future is more ground penetrating radar.
Well, that's great. Yeah. Well, we do have a lot of folks that listen to the show that are involved with those disciplines, a lot of people working with those modern technologies. So, hey, if anyone's listening out there and they need the assistance there at the University of North Florida for this site, certainly reach out to them. And, it's important that we continue to build this community, everybody working together. I'm always amazed when I find a new archaeological site. You think you're on top of everything, but Mill Cove, honestly, was brand new to me. And I've learned a lot here tonight. So we've been speaking with Dr. Keith Ashley, Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of North Florida, and also graduate student Victoria Hayes. She's going to be moving on to the University of Florida, currently at the University of North Florida. We thank you both for being here. Now, Dr. Ashley, if anybody wants to follow along or contact you and find out more about the Mill Cove Complex, what do they need to do in order to follow along with the research?
We have a website, UNF Archaeology Lab, so they can always check out there, and it has contact information for me. So if anyone has any questions, just hit that. So it's UNF Archaeology Lab.
All right. Well, there you have it, folks. Make sure that you get out there and support these sites. Get out there and learn more about the local community sites that you have. Everybody has them in their area for the most part. I want to thank our guest, Dr. Keith Ashley, and of course, Victoria Hayes. Victoria, the best of luck with your continuing education, and thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you, Jason. We appreciate it.
We want to thank Dr. Keith Ashley for joining us, also his graduate student, Victoria. We wish her all the best in her continuing education. But, for me, this was very, very interesting because I wasn't aware of these mound building cultures in North Florida, even though I'm very close to this and I live in this world of archaeology. Somehow I've managed to miss this. So for me personally, this was a great interview and really taught me a lot about North Florida there that I had no idea of previously.
I didn't know about these either. And, with all of the different mound sites that we visited in the past, maybe when the temperature cools down a little bit, I mean, if that happens in Florida, North Florida, maybe just a little bit, maybe if we go in like December or January, but I'd love to get down there and actually see some of those mound sites. And there are also a few in North Carolina too, although again, many of those mounds that I had heard about for many years, they're no longer there. I recall years ago, Jason, you and I traveling down to Old Fort, North Carolina, where I'd been told that at one time there was a mound. We went down there and certainly found no evidence of such mound in said location, so I don't know if it had been destroyed. Sometimes that happens. I don't know if it had been looted. I don't know if both of those or neither of those had occurred. Who knows the circumstances, but sometimes it really does feel like a race against time to try and preserve the past. And again, in light of our earlier discussion about cultural resource management, and, the pros and the cons of preserving the past. I mean, it's always a good thing to preserve the past, but I mean, it has to be done sensibly too. And then you also look at the idea of preserving archaeology as a science. I don't think it's going anywhere, but when I hear about North Carolina universities that are doing away with their archaeology and anthropology programs, that's a huge problem because, again, those who do not know their past are doomed to repeat it. We are still learning things about the past, the ancient past, in fact, and when I was in Greensboro, I was moderating a spirited panel discussion that several of our friends and colleagues were on. Randy Daniel, Malcolm LeCompte, Joanne Ballard, Dallas Abbott, and also, of course, Mark Young joining us remotely from Australia. But again, that's what the core of what the Comet Research Group is trying to do, to understand what's happening in the ancient past, way far back toward the end of the Pleistocene, and also determine if indeed there had been an extraterrestrial impact, and whether that kind of a thing could happen again. So it's incumbent upon us to rely on the tools that archaeology and geology and other sciences provide us to help us fill in those missing puzzle pieces, because who knows, one day in the future, we may desperately need all that. You never really know what could happen, but looking at the past, it is my contention, definitely gives you a better idea. And those who do know the past and who have studied it, who have studied history and who have gone even further, deeper into time, and studied the archaeology, they are far better equipped to make those determinations. So guys, that about wraps things up for this installment of the podcast. As always, thank you for being here with me. I hope we can now gather together and head into the Cross Time Pub. And of course, those of you out there listening, you can always follow our work online at 7ages.org. On behalf of Jason Pentrail, James Waldo, and yours truly, I am Micah Hanks. We are the 7 Ages Research Associates, and we will see you next time somewhere in time right here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.